Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. My name is Leon Jones, and as you know, I'm getting people educated on the ideologies that are heard on the news, that are heard by different politicians. Now, last week I did capitalism. Now, I was listening to a debate between Fatty and Chaotic Truth. And I like how it's funny how people from Europe, they tell you how good socialism really is. And they tell you about the unfairness capitalism is. But one thing you have to understand, socialism is the next step toward communism. Socialism is nothing but the collectivist, the welfare state, where they want to utilize the government to redistribute everything. Just because they have government run healthcare doesn't mean that it is good. Canada is a socialist system. They have government run healthcare. You had a lot of countries who were communist, particularly your Polands. They broke away from Russia. You had Vladimir Lenin, Stalin. Now, of course, socialism works both ways. Yes, it does. When you're on the left, we call it socialism. Or when you're on the right, we call it fascism, which fascism is another name for National Socialism. And who was famous for National Socialism? Adolf Hitler. So you have to balance everything out. In my humble opinion, socialism is what we call the welfare state. Now, if you look at the United States, do we have a socialist system? We have a safety net, but it's not really socialist here. We have more or less a capitalistic system. Now, capitalism has its flaws where the businesses control the workers, but capitalism is an economic system to where you're in business to make a profit. This is what individuals don't know. And when I hear people from York talking about how good socialism is, well, socialism is good in their countries because they don't have a large population. I mean, you look at Portugal, you look at Sweden, you look at Denmark. The populations are small, so you can have socialism. But when you have a population of 350 million people, socialism isn't going to work here. You have to have a lot of taxpayers who are going to pay into the system. Now, you have Democrats who really want socialism. They think that it's going to make everything equal. But you know, under a socialistic system, you have greedy people as well. Let's get into the real definition of what, what is socialism? What is socialism? What is socialism? Let's, let's get into it. As I share my screen, socialism. It's an economic and political philosophy where the community or the state collectively owns and manages the means of production. You have your resources, your factories, and your businesses rather than the individuals. In other words, the state. Who is the state? The government is the state. So they're the ones who own all the resources. And what the government is going to do to so called reduce inequality What the government is going to do is ensure that wealth is distributed based on societal needs rather than providing profit. Now, a number of us don't agree with that. This is why we're here in the United States. And when it comes to socialism, the core principles of it is it's collective ownership, where you have major industries, natural resources, infrastructure, they're all controlled by the public, the community, or the government. Then you have your production for use. Goods and services are created to meet human needs like housing, healthcare, and education, rather than to maximize corporate profit. And you have your economic equality. Socialists believe in minimizing the gap between the rich and the poor through progressive taxation, social programs, and wealth redistribution. So the main types of socialism, and this is what we have here in America, what the Democrats want. They call it democratic socialism. And democratic socialism is basically advocates for a political democracy alongside a socially owned economy. So basically, citizens vote to control major industries while maintaining democratic freedoms. Then you have social democracy. Social democracy is where you have a system that basically retains a society that is capitalist. In other words, it's a free market economy. However, within that free market economy, you have heavy uses of taxation and a lot of government intervention. And what that is going to do, it's going to provide social safety nets like free education and universal health care. This is what Bernie Sanders wants. And then you have what we call Marxism and communism. Now, can you look at the communist system? What happens when you have a communist system? This is what the lefties want. Well, you have envisions of a transitional stage where the state controls the economy. That is scary. The state controls the economy, which is going to eventually lead to a society that is classless, stateless. It's where all of the property is publicly owned. Now, what is publicly owned? Publicly owned means the government owns everything, everything that you do. That's what that means. This is why you have a number of individuals who are very ignorant out here. They don't know anything about socialism. Let me share my screen again here. Just bear with. I just want you to see one thing. And this is where people get caught up. This is where everybody right here, this social democracy, you hear that with the Democrats. Both of these two right here lead to this third one. But why do these Democrats advocate for what they call democracy? We do not live in a democracy. We live in a republic. And this is what individuals don't understand. Now, let's move over. Let's get into the PowerPoint here. Okay. What is socialism today? Conceptions of a cooperative society. Now, this is not my PowerPoint. This goes back 6 years. John E. Romer. He is a professor at Yale University. Now, Bernie Sanders and AOC are self-proclaimed socialists. Now, this is where everything gets sticky. There was a poll taken back in 2019 of young people between 18 and 34, and they said they preferred socialism to capitalism. Well, these young people don't even understand what capitalism or socialism is. What they are doing is they're hearing what the media and what their professors are telling them in college. They're getting brainwashed. And what is the Sanders AOC view of socialism of these young people? Well, it is taxation with investment in education, infrastructure, childcare, college education, better social insurance, beefed up antitrust. So the implicity, it is a social democracy. This is where property relations in firms would remain largely or completely private. Now, I just read you, let's go back, show you what democratic socialism is. They call it socialist democracy. Here it is right here. This is exactly what they're talking about. It's a system that retains a capitalist free market. But what else did I tell you? It sounds good, but there's going to be a lot of government regulations and heavy taxation. So, yes, everything would remain private. However, the government, you're going to have a heavy taxation. Now, three pillars of any economic system. It's a behavioral ethos, a distributive ethic, and a set of institutions, property, relations, markets. Socialism's three pillars. It's a cooperative behavioral ethos, people in solidarity struggling against the constraints of nature, a distributive ethic, from each according to his ability to each according to his work. Property relations, to be discussed here. You have an idea. Well, if people behave according to the ethos, then the distributive ethic will be implemented by the institutions. The institution, the government. Now, capitalism's three pillars. This is where we are. It's an individualistic distributive ethic where each person competes against all other persons under the constraints of nature. Well, might throw some Charles Darwin in the mix with this because if you think about it, Charles Darwin said only the strong survive. Capitalism is extremely competitive, and you have a number of individuals who can't compete or are not willing to compete. This is why they want socialism. And then with the distributive ethic, to each according to what he can get, constrained by laws and contract. And then private relations. Well, you have private ownership of all productive factors and firms. The focus here is to introduce the behavioral ethos and cooperation in economic models with socialist property relations. To date, cooperation in models of socialism has been limited to alternative property relations, specifically in which workers receive the entire output of firms. But alternatively, property relations are insufficient to capture the behavioral ethos of cooperation. Now, your individual ethos in capitalism. Well, it's modeled by the Nash optimization in games. So the individualistic ethos of capitalism is modeled by Nash optimization in games, which means this neatly captures the idea that each economic player is going at it alone. So what does that mean? Individually. It is not collective. Now, when you model socialism's cooperative by the Kantian optimization, that means each players act in concert, which means they act as a collective, as a group. Again, capitalism with taxation. Well, a single good produced by G, K to the L equals X, households endowed with labor and capital, and shares with the firm 5. And you have your preferences. Then you have your AD equilibrium at tax rate. This is the mathematics that you get with taxation. See, with capitalism, there is a progressive tax structure. And the funny thing about it is you get the individuals who say the rich don't pay their fair share. The rich pay the majority of the taxes because we have a progressive tax system. We don't have a flat tax system. And here's all the mathematics, Pareto. I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to show you where all the economics comes from. Now, the dead weight loss of taxation is due to Nash optimization of agents and their factor supply decisions. We should not view this as a market failure, but it's claimed as a failure of the individualistic ethos represented by the Nash optimization of going at it alone, treating the other players' actions as parametric rather than part of the action. Again, I'm giving you this information from a Harvard professor here. And when it comes to capitalism, you have a lot of arguments about capitalism. Well, you have the 80 equilibrium is only Pareto efficient in the absence of taxation. What is the Pareto principle? It's the 80-20 rule. So when you have capitalism, well, it said that prices decentralize the allocation. So if you look at everything, a central planner would have to solve millions and billions of equations to produce a Pareto efficient allocation, assuming it knew all consumers' preferences and all firms' technologies. Then you have the dynamics. That's the profit maximization. And it suggests that there will be an incentive to innovate and improve technology. See, under socialism and communism, nobody's really going to innovate anything because there's no incentive. Because the minute you innovate something and you make money, you're going to be taxed. So these compromise an argument for capitalism, despite all the caveats. The Wall Street Journal emphasizes that FTWE almost every page, every day, they conclude that taxation should be minimal. Well, I agree with that because the more people you have working, guess what? The higher volume of taxpayers you have, you can lower the tax rates. And then the government is going to get more revenue. Problem is, when the government gets a lot of revenue, it's supposed to go to the Americans, but it's going overseas to other countries as well. Now, the variance of socialism, the challenge is to provide a blueprint that distributes the entire surplus to workers and investors in a way that preserves decentralization but expands the scope for Pareto efficiency. So, the secret ingredient is modeling the corporate ethos. So now, models of socialism, that is the precise formulations, have given only lip service, not formal representation to cooperation. And it's still given lip service because you have a number of people here who are rich and they're talking about socialism, mainly the Democratic Party. And you have some individuals on the right as well. Now you have the Kantian optimization. I'm not going to go through that. This is a lot of mathematics. I'm just giving you an overview so you understand how socialism works. Because there are many of us who go to school, we don't ask these questions. We just hear on CNN that the rich keep getting richer, the billionaires, and a lot of the millionaires. That's class envy. Okay, I'm going to skip over to social democracy with all the mathematical factors here. Okay, well, even at a tax rate of unity supports a PE allocation and the Gini of the income distribution is zero. So basically, when you have the Kantian optimization, it completely separates the issues of efficiency and equity, which is redistribution, or we call it distribution. So citizens can choose any desired degree of equality between the laissez-faire, that's the capitalist, and zero, and implement it with taxation, with no effect on economic efficiency. Also, with socialism, there are no private firm owners. The surplus after workers and investors are paid through their contributions, and it's divided amongst workers and investors in some fixed proportion. So again, take you through a bunch of mathematics here. Now, why should investors share in the profits? Well, capitalism has changed radically since 1850 when Marx wrote the CM was published in 1848. Now, what is the CM? It's the Communist Manifesto. That's right. If you're not familiar with that, it's the Communist Manifesto. You see, Karl Marx claimed that he was a socialist, but he was really a communist. He said he was a socialist because communism wasn't going to sell. Now, Marxism wrote that capital comes into being dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. Indeed, investors in that day were largely the aristocracy who traced their wealth to enclosures of peasant commons, royal largesses in early times. The middle class, such as it was, had very little wealth. Today, the middle class owns 56.5% of the wealth in the United States. The top 1% owns 41%. The bottom own the bottom 50% only own 2.5%. Now, why? Because basically the bottom 50%, for the most part, they're your workers. These are the ones who are probably on welfare. These are the ones who really don't think about having business, or they do, but they just don't have the means. Now, one can argue that middle class wealth comes into being dripping with blood and dirt. It comes mainly from inheritance and savings from labor income. Socialists must view savings as legitimate and must provide incentives for workers to save. Democratically and presumably, it will be less than one. Inheritance is another matter. Equality of opportunity must restrict it. Well, see, now you're putting a government regulation. So the government should restrict inheritance. Well, a lot of wealth has been passed down from generation to generation, starting with the Rockefellers, Carnegie Mellon. Returns to scale. Macroeconomists typically estimate the macro production function as having CRS. But if this is to the equilibria of social democracy without taxation, socialism too are exactly the laissez-faire capitalist equilibrium. Why? Because they differ from the A to D capitalist allocation only in how profits are distributed. With CRS, there are zero profits in competitive equilibrium. So basically, all income is interest payment to investors, bonds, shareholders get nothing. Now, if macroeconomists are right, or in macroeconomics, if individuals are right, then why do we see profits? The latest estimates are that profits comprise 29% of the corporate value that's added. Wages comprise 61% and capital costs, example, interest on bonds, comprise 10%. Why profits with CRS? Well, if returns are really CRS, then profits exist because the market equilibrium is not competitive. Firms have substantial market power. Antitrust has died in the US in the last 30 years. And here's how everything works: the graphs, the profit share, the capital share. Now, some market power is legitimate to the extent that patents are legitimate. So, you have some that do not contend that profits would be zero in the socialist blueprint, and profits would be shared amongst investors and workers with robust antitrust. However, their share in capital income would most likely fall. Now, is profit maximization bad? Well, we associate the myriad evils with profit maximization: child labor, rapid assembly line speeds, firing workers for organizing unions, environmental deregulation. But the socialist blueprints, and there are others, all rely on profit maximization. Indeed, the secret to achieving Pareto efficiency is profit max plus Catanian optimization. So I don't think we should just throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, you have to put the public bads in the model. We now suppose that there is a public bad that accompanies production. So suppose this public bad is monotone, increasing the total output. And that's why consumers dislike the public bad. Thus, utility is now a function. Now, again, you really have to study the social democratic equilibrium with taxation in a public bad. The definition of equilibrium is just as socialism one, except for the change in the utility functions to include the public bad. Then you have Proposition 3. The social economic equilibrium with the public bad at any tax rate is Pareto efficient. That is, Catanian optimization by workers and investors limits production to the extent that consumers wish to do so. So you have a trade-off between the output and the public bad is basically Pareto optimal. And then additive Catanian optimization kills two birds with one stone. And in other words, the deadweight loss of taxation and the inefficient levels of the public bad. Of course, there will be different preferences amongst the citizens regarding how bad the public bad is and how much it should be restricted. So at low levels of the economic development, citizens might well desire levels of the public bad that are basically too large by the standards of citizens in developed countries. And here's a graph. So basically, we have a tentative conclusion. The advent of a patrimonial middle class has changed the formula from each according to his ability to each according to his work to from each according to his endowments and preferences to each according to his contributions. So savings must be legitimate and encouraged under socialism. Inheritance must be circumscribed to implement equality of opportunity over time. So technology may be close to CRS, in which case competitive profits will be close to zero. So these two features of today implement that the relative equality of income that socialists desire cannot be accomplished by simply changing the property rights in firms. It must be achieved with taxation, provision of public goods, and social insurance. Taxation, however, can be efficient with the containing optimization. The blueprint of social democracy with taxation, it is attractive. However, people believe you have a number of people that believe property relations of the sharing economy are even more attractive. So, by eliminating a category of income which is not a return to factor suppliers, i.e., shareholders, dividends, is ethically attractive. So, a full analysis should take into account the effect of property relations in firms on the social ethos. So, distributing the entire product of the economy to those who supply factors of production and eliminating the class of workers who receive a share of the surplus but are otherwise passive will stimulate the cooperative ethos that is so lacking in contemporary capitalism. On the social ethos, FDR's address to Congress back in 1943. So basically, FDR in his speech to Congress said discrepancies between low personal incomes and very high personal incomes should be lessened. And he believed in that time of this grave national danger, when all excess income should go to win the war, no American citizen ought to have a net income after he has paid his taxes of more than $25,000 a year, equivalent to about $1 million in 2019. Well, again, FDR, he was also a Democrat as well. And in fact, when FDR was president, the country was getting into World War II. However, we were just coming off of the stock market crashing in 1929. And this is when all the social programs, because prior to that, we didn't have a welfare system. Americans did it without welfare. Now, you did have an income tax, and the income tax was supposed to be used to fund World War I. She didn't have Medicaid, Medicare, didn't have any of that. So if you really look at America, America does have a safety net. It does. Because I know people of European nature, they have all these ideas, but you think about it. They come over here and teach in our colleges, and they teach where they're coming from. And you have a number of individuals who don't like socialism, but they certainly fill the heads of students in college, oh, that socialism is good. Just because something sounds good on the surface, you have to look deeply into the topic to see what it's all about. Because something that sounds good is not always good. Capitalism is very competitive. Yes, it has its problems, but I prefer owning something rather than the government taking what I work for to distribute it to people who don't work for anything. You hear the ruling and the proletarians. Well, I want to switch gears for a moment. Why should I go to work and bust my ass all day and pay for people who aren't doing anything? Because you have lazy people. Why should they be subsidized? They're not putting what Joe Biden said, skin in the game. They're living off the fat of the lamb. In other words, they're parasitic. I'm the host and you're a parasite. This is what we talk about America. We always talk about the other way. Oh, we have a lot of greedy people. Yeah, you do have greedy people, but you have a lot of freeloaders as well. We don't ever talk about freeloaders as much. In fact, when you have social programs, it encourages irresponsibility. Look at a number of women who have babies out of wedlock. It actually decreases the family structure. And it puts government more involved in everybody's business because they're now supplying the resources. And this is why you have a lot of incentives here in America to be single mothers and not get married. Because Big Daddy is the government. And it gives a number of women in this country the idea that they are independent. They can go without a husband. Well, when you have the resources of the state telling you you don't need him in your life, we'll supply you with what you need. It's going to get in their head to where they're not going to need a husband. That's Big Daddy government. So overall, when we talk about socialism, it's an economic and political philosophy. Again, socialism is an economic and political philosophy where communities or the state, they collectively own. Let me go back again. You think about that. Socialism is an economic and political philosophy or ideology. It's where the community or the state collectively owns and manages the means of production, resources, factories, and businesses, rather than the individuals. So the core goal is to reduce inequality and ensure wealth is distributed based on societal needs rather than providing profit. Core principles: collective ownership, major industries, natural resources, and infrastructure are controlled by the public, the community, or the government. Production for use. Goods and services are created to meet human needs like housing, healthcare, and education, rather than to maximize corporate profit. Economic equality. Socialists believe in minimizing the gap between the rich and poor through progressive taxation, social programs, and wealth redistribution. There are many types of socialism. I've given you the big one in the middle, but democratic socialism advocates, it basically advocates for a political democracy alongside a socially owned economy. Citizens vote to control major industries while maintaining democratic freedoms. Then you have social democracy. It's a system that retains a capitalist free market economy, but it uses heavy taxation and government intervention to provide robust social safety nets, universal health care, free education. And you have Marxism and communism, visions a transitional stage where the state controls the economy, eventually leading to a classless, stateless society where all property is publicly owned. Now, if you listen to that, it might sound good to people. But if you think about it, people always talk about capitalism, there's greed. Well, if you look at socialism, the main body that's running everything is the government. So the government is going to give you what they believe, like they want ABI or UBI, universal basic income. So if you go to work as a dentist, the government might say, well, we're going to give you $1,000 a week. And it doesn't mean that what the government is going to give you is going to be sufficient. Doesn't mean that the health care is going to be good. Doesn't mean that the housing is going to be good. They don't look at crime rates. And when you have a system, you're always going to have greedy people, regardless. And in communism, the government owns everything. So what the government's going to say is, okay, we're going to take this 70% and leave the citizens with 30%, but we're going to tell the citizens that 30% is 100%, and we're going to distribute that 30% as 100%, while the government is going to maintain that 70%, and they're going to live in luxury while the citizens are still poor, especially if you have a large population. Now your Portugals, your Englands, your Germanys. Germany used to have a good economy. Your Frances, yeah, they all have socialism. Canada has socialism, but they don't have the population. And it's funny because Canadians, when it comes to their health care, yeah, I've been told, yeah, you go and you get free health care and everything. I don't know how good it is. And I can't listen to somebody who lives in York. I got to experience it because they can tell me anything. Sounds good. And this is what I'm saying. When it comes to socialism, a number of individuals will tell you it, at the surface how good it is. Go live in socialist countries to see how good they really are. See how good your housing is. I guarantee you'll be living in a bunch of projects. Because I know in Poland, Czechoslovakia, those countries in Eastern Europe, they were under communism. East Germany was under communism. And I looked at some of those houses. They were ghettos. It's where the term ghetto came from. Poor people. That's what happens when you live. Now, I'm not saying capitalism, you don't have poor people, but in the United States, we don't have pure capitalism. We almost have a social democracy. Not that we almost have it. We almost have it. I mean, capitalism today is a lot different than capitalism in the past. Yes, there used to be antitrust laws, and today you have a lot of mergers, which basically eliminates a lot of competition. So, in other words, you have like the cell phone market. You used to have four cell phone providers. Now you have three since Sprint was gulped up by T-Mobile. So yeah, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. Yeah, you have other ones out there, but those other cell phone companies, what do? They use the towers, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. So you do have some monopolies out there. Kroger, um, they're run by Albertson stores. Well, they seem to have the market for the chain grocery stores. Bottom line, it's small business that actually gives you a better product. So don't tell me that under socialism in the United States, you're going to live a good life. You're going to be poor as well. In fact, you're going to be poor and the government is going to regulate everything. And this is what the Democrats want. So the Democrats want to put socialism in place so they end up living lavish lifestyles while all of us become poor. Be careful what you ask for. You just may get it because Mom Donnie, what he wants to do, he wants to look at apartments, wants to go out there, have the cities, because they have a lot of slumlords in New York, so have the inspectors, what they're going to do to these landlords. And here's the key. The inspector's going to go out, look at the apartments, they're going to document defects, and then they're going to find the landlords. The landlords are not going to have enough money to make the repairs. And when they don't have enough money to make the repairs, what's going to happen? Well, the city is going to take the apartments from the landlords. And what is the city going to do? Turn them into projects. They're going to own the apartments themselves. And who are they going to put in there? So just because something's owned by the government, it doesn't mean that it is good. And that's the plan. So while the Democrats, it might look like they're losing power on the surface nationally, They're going to try to maintain power through the local and state governments, particularly through your blue cities, because that's where you have the majority of the populations. But in the end, when it comes to socialism, be careful what you ask for. Before you think something is good, experience it. I know capitalism has its flaws, but I always believe if you want to win, you got to compete. Some people don't want to compete. I'm not going to say that it is very difficult, that it's very easy to compete. You have to have drive. But in the long run, I want you to be the judge. What would you prefer? Free market capitalism or a collectivist system under socialism where the government, they own the rights to all the resources? And see how much innovation you get. Because under socialism, it's not going to be any incentive to innovate. You look at Cuba, what kind of cars they're driving. So if you don't understand capitalism, communism, fascism, pick up a book, read about it. Look who the players are. Karl Marx was a big player in socialism. Vladimir Lenin, Stalin, they were big players in communism. Raul Castro, Fidel Castro, Genghis Khan, Mao Zedong. Now, Mussolini was a fascist. Hitler was also a fascist. You have all these leaders. They spoke what you wanted to hear. You didn't agree with what they said. What happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. And Hitler was half Jewish. And the political left out here is trying to strong arm the people with all their violence to force us to believe in that bullshit that they're talking about. But that's all it is. Many people don't even know what socialism is. They hear something on TV, they don't read about it, and they run with it. And even some of your politicians, they never lived in socialist countries. I'm going to be honest with you, Democrat or Republican, they want us to live under socialism while they continue their greed by taking from us under capitalism. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 401 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some STEM content, check out the QCIS channel. On that channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, here's where you can find me. 401 Talk Zone radio show. You can find me right here on YouTube, X formerly Twitter. Also find me on Rumble and Truth Social. And for the QCIS channel, find me right here on YouTube, X formerly Twitter, and of course, LinkedIn. I just want to say this. Always be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Just know that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. And if it doesn't apply, better. If it doesn't apply, just let it fly. But if the shoe fits, wear it. If you don't like the shoe, just change it. And once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the 4 One Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful, gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.